Okay. All right. So, wow. Okay, we're here. The fast day. It's intense. You know, I tried my best, this morning to wake up relatively, I thought early, and to go to the old city, the Temple Mount. Everyone knows I'm really in the Temple Mount, the whole thing. But the thing is that I was going especially early because I was really trying to avoid, you know, the the heat. Like I didn't want to be out there like it's just like really, really hot, and you get sweating, and you get dehydrated, and it's not good, right? And you have to fast, it's like you're suffering. But so I got there, and it was just like such a line, and it was a really interesting moment. A couple of interesting things happened on Temple Mount, and one of the things that was interesting is that when you go into the Kotel area, they have kind of like a checkpoint type of a thing where they have metal detectors or whatever, and you go in the Kotel, right? And on this particular interest, they have a few different like lanes, like they have one lane for women, one lane for men. Sometimes women have personal stuff, that they pull out of their purse or whatever. Anyway, so they just they have different places, right? Now the thing is that the thing is that so there's like normally like two main lanes, sometimes three, but two main lanes, and then you go through, and then on the far right you have a line specifically for people to go to the Temple Mount, right? And it's a very small lane, right? Because obviously traditionally a lot of people it wasn't such a thing, but it's becoming so big now that the lane to go up to the Temple Mount overtook two lanes on that. Like they had to expand it because there was so many people. And so it was a very interesting thing to see like how much the consciousness of Israel. I think a lot of it's like post October 7th, post, the Iran war, like how many people are really starting to yearn for the rebuilding of the base of Mikdash, right? And thank God we have leaders like Ben Gvir and other people that really have made it really have allowed us to have a lot of freedoms on the Temple Mount, more freedoms than we have ever seen, right, in thousands of years, right? And one of the things what we were talking about today was I talked about was so that was one situation, right? Was just seeing how many people wanted to come, right? Another situation, which I'm glad I didn't have it on video, but it was like an incident. So we were on the Temple Mount, and generally we have a large amount of security around us, right? And the security, is pretty much police, military, type of things, right? and 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 so they usually like when the Arabs that are on the top of the Temple Mount, they generally want to. So, brother, they generally they generally kind of like keep us separate, right? So we're walking around the temple, like kind of like towards the more northern part of the temple, if I want to describe it. And so there was an Arab guy there, and he was kind of eating his food, whatever. He was like a big guy too, and he was just kind of like staring at us. And so the police were like, you got to move away. We have a crowd of people coming. And I guess he didn't want to move or something like that. So, anyways, they physically removed him, right? It was like it was just so interesting because I'm with like at this point I'm in a group of like maybe like 60 Jewish people because they had us all in these groups, like probably like 50, 60 people. per group. And so all the Jews start cheering, right? And it was just like at first it was just like I was just looking at it, I was like, oh God. Because see the thing is it's like it's hard for people outside of Eretz Israel to really see how deep the conflict is between the Palestinians and the Israelis are. You know what I mean? It's like it's really hard. And the thing about it, it's not even like a Jewish Muslim thing. You know what I mean? That's a part of it, of course. You know, as any people who are fighting each other, whatever differences they have are going to be magnified, right? But but the point is still to say that the point is just to say that but it's a deep hatred. It's a very deep hatred, and it's because of like years of war, you know, and I think a lot of the like I want to reframe that. I don't want to. There is a hatred, you know, there is a hatred, and it's hard to explain it. But there is also a high common respect. So how does that exist, right? How does do people? You say there's a big respect between these people, and then there's also, you know, a hatred. When I say there's a hatred, you know, when I say that there's a hatred, it's I mean, there's just been so many wars, you know, and even before 1948, right? There's just been so many wars between these particular group of people, and you know, one of the things is that like you really have to look at how the British operate, right? So like even when you look at like you know look at like Nigeria for example, right? So Nigeria was you know country Nigeria was pretty much a country you know colonized you know by the British, and so when you look at how they carved out the territory of Nigeria, you'll see like there's different tribes, right? You have like the Hausa tribes that are like in the north, you have the Igbos that are in the east, the southeast is like Igbo, and then you have, you know, I guess I don't know, north either eastern, north southern, whether and you have like what do they call it? What's the other tribe? I can't even think of it. You know, but they have different tribes, right? But the point is saying that the way that the territory was carved out, that the people themselves, it was done in a way that the people would ultimately be fighting and competing for resources, and ultimately leading to like kind of like a very chaotic environment where a lot of wars happen. And we look at Nigeria to this day, there's still tons of wars, right? Of the different tribes, right? So you have Hausa, Igbo, and God, what's the other one? My friend Zakari's from this tribe. I can't think of it. Anyways, yeah, these tribes, right? So when you look at the same thing, when you look at how the territory was carved out by the British here in 1948, right? You will see a similar dynamic, right? You will see a similar dynamic where, you know, you'll see a similar dynamic where the way that the territory is carved out is that the Jews took the property and the Arabs didn't. And then the Arabs' position is like the British or United Nations, whoever didn't have authority to do it. Whatever. That's their position. The point is saying the way that the territories have been sketched out has led to more and more conflict. So when you look at the conflict of Israel Palestine, you can't start with the you know the Jews and the Arabs fighting each other. You have to look at the Ottomans, the Turks, the British. You know what I'm saying? And so that that relationship to the land and how these kind of like two minority groups with the Jews and the Palestinians, you know, kind of like you know got in this situation, right? and so that that part is just a really it's just a very important part to understand that the people in many ways were set up for failure by design of the territory, by the geographical carving out of the land. They were put in a position to have conflict, right? So that's one point. Second point is second point is saying, so out of that you have two people who are competing for property land, and the thing is, the bottom line is that you know um you know the way that the Muslims interpret land ownership, right? The way that they understand land ownership is basically like, hey, if Muslims conquer the land, it's Muslim land forever, right? And anybody else who's on that land is an invader, right? So that's the way that's their position with this region. So when it came to Western legal systems, right, of like property ownership and transfer of property, transfer of ownership, that's not really a part of the culture, right? I mean, I think you can see more modern day people, adapting such things, but like in general, that's not such a thing. So like their perception of land and ownership and control is much different than ours, right? And so, you have that ideology of an Islamic Sharia law understanding of land, and then you have a Western court system, you know, say British or whatever, that that perspective is also um, those are also two conflicts too as well, like the perception of what a legal system is and what a legal system is, and distribution of property and who controls that. Those are two different aspects too. So when we look at the conflict, it's not, and when I say there's a deep hatred, it's a deep separation is probably a better word, right? It's a deep separation that that they could still respect each other, meaning that like, hey, the Jews don't believe Arabs are idol worshippers, or anything like that. And, you know, whatever. The Torah says great things about Ishmael at the end of his life, right? So it's not that, but you still have to look at the overall scheme, how there's so many layers of deep separation and how people are playing against each other. And I even said this earlier to a group of Palestinians in the chat, on this app, that, I believe the Palestinian people and the Israeli people have respect for each other, but they're both victims right now of the military industrial complex, where you have people in leadership on both sides, that, are being accused of by their citizens of benefiting from the conflicts, right? The people are saying that. This is not my personal position, right? So, anyways, okay. So that being said, and I just think it's an important part of just recognition, because, we're in the ninth of Av, we're in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, we're in this whole frame. And so, from this perspective, right? So from this perspective, we gotta go into it, because the same issues that we were talking about, right? 2,000 years ago, right? What's conflict inside of the land and people fighting and starvation and bloodbath, all of this. I mean, we're dealing with similar things right now, no? So what I want to do is I want to bring some Rabbi Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And I want to bring Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, and he writes a essay on for the 10th of Av, right? We know the ninth of Av is a big fast day, and it's like the culmination of a 3-week period of reliving the process of the issues that led ultimately to the exile, and elevating the exile. Like last Shabbat was Shabbat Chazon, Chazon, similar to my last name, Chazan, but Chazon, the ability to see vision, um, um, to have vision, to see in the future, and to see the future redemption, some people say. So we're at the end of that process, we're at the end of the culmination process of that. And at the end of that process is a huge moment of recognition, right? Of being like, hey, you know, um, we made it through this process. So now Rabbi Sacks writes the essay on the day after, right? The 10th of Av, right? In his essay that he brings out, sometimes when we're in the middle of something, right? It's kind of hard to understand how great it is, how momentous it is, into retrospect, right? The day after, right? And that day after, um, and that day after kind of like allows us to reflect on the whole process. So he writes an essay for the day after this day of the ninth of Av. And I think from there we could kind of like backtrack and see where we're at today. It's a little, I don't know if we'll get to the thing, but for the 10th of Av. He says, redeeming the ruins, right? Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and blessed memory. He says, how do we behave in exile, especially when we do not feel as though we are in exile? We turn to Jeremiah, the prophet who foretold that the first exile to Babylon for advice. All right, so we go to Jeremiah. What does he say? He preempted what the ancient Israelites may have thought was the appropriate religious response by writing a letter to his followers. The gloom and doom that we naturally expect the prophet to suggest he says in the fields that fills pages after pages of his prophetic testimony is curiously absent from his letter. Instead, he presents a formula that strikes us a contemporary with a contemporary resonance. And he says in chapter 29, we read of a letter that Jeremiah wrote to a group of exiles in Babylon, which he dispatched from the land of Israel with so he says um El Sa'ah, El Asa, El Asa, the man who King I can't even like I need to like see everything in Hebrew now to like say it. He said who's King Zedekiah, Zedekiah, Zedekiah from Babylon to see King Nebuchadnezzar. He says, in addition to Isaiah's diplomatic mission, he was also to present this letter as a guidance for a small but growing community of exiles. The chapter began with the letter intended audience. It says this text of the letter which the prophet Isaiah sent to Jerusalem to the priests and the prophets the rest of the elders of the exile community, in all of which whom Nebuchadnezzar exiled from Jerusalem. Okay, I guess this is a letter written by Jeremiah. Okay, so the bottom line is that Jeremiah writes this letter and it gets sent. He says the conditions of the exile changes personal and communal identity, right? So this is a very important point, right? Because up until this point, you have to realize like this is a huge concept. The Jewish people like had a dynasty for over 1,000 years, right? And and from this dynasty, right, and from this whole process of being at an exalted level, being with God's Shekhinah, and this whole process to fall out of that, right? To fall out of that and to go into exile and to not know who you are anymore, right? And to not know who your purpose is and not what you're about. And from here, you build a new relationship with God. He says, you are in the place, but your heart and your mind are in another place. He says, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi he says, I am in the west and my heart is in the east. To be in exile is to never to reconcile yourself with where you are, but to live in a persistent hope of where you want to be. In the book of Esther, Mordecai is the only person introduced as an exile, as someone who knows that he is not where he should be, he should where he should ultimately be at the time of immense assimilation. Imagine the immigrant who asks who he is, always mention the place he comes from and not the place of where he currently resides, and lives in perpetual dislocation. It's an interesting thing. You see different people come to America, different groups, different people, and they kind of like come there and they say, you know what? We came here and we started a new life. From this point on, this is our life, this is where we live, and we move on. Maybe, generations later, they remember where their family came from, the details. No, but this is their new life. But for Jews, it's never been that way, right? It's always been that we had to go from one place to the next, always in this kind of like constant state of like, they said like during the time of during Pesach, we had to Seder table, but you eat, but you eat like in a way that you're not like at ease, you're not relaxed, you know, you're about to make a big journey, right? You're about to change the world. You're about to go on a journey no one in human history has ever been on. So you're there at the sense of ease. So Jesus have always been in that kind of like state, no matter where they traveled at, where they lived at, right? They were always in a place of like this constant, connection. He said Jeremiah perhaps realized the crippling impact of the dislocation on the soul of the people, and advised against this kind of thinking. He says, "Thus the Lord." So this is what he writes in the book of Jeremiah. So he says the Lord, he says this says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to the whole community, which I exiled from Babylon, which I've exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in the palms gardens and eat fruits. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives of sons and give your daughters to husbands, and they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decease, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For the prosperity you shall prosper. He says in line after line, Jeremiah adds to demand across generations, not only in the immediacy of the day, but with the foreknowledge that the exile can become more of a momentary condition, but a way of life. So that's a big deal, right? Because we talk a lot about the destruction of the temple. And that's like, wow, it's like a shock, right? It's like a ballistic missile hits a building, boom, it's gone, destroyed, right? So over here, we're saying something. He's going a step further, right? He's talking about this process of the exile, right? You're no longer in your place. You're no longer where you're safe. You're no longer, you know, in your community. You no longer have that familiarity. You're in a new place now. You know, Sometimes people, like even myself, you think about like, being married and then getting divorced and the whole thing, and it's a certain type of an exile in a way, right? Because you have your home, you have your environment, you have your family, you get used to it, it exists for years, you have different dynamics, right? And and then all of a sudden, boom, everything changes. You no longer have your home, you no longer have that environment. And you're kind of like in this exile and you don't really know where to go, and you're just kind of like wandering around in a way and trying to like reconfigure this reality. This is what Chief Rabbi Sachs is trying to get us to, right? He's trying to get us to that place of understanding like the experiences that we have, all the experiences that we've had of struggle and success can be found in the history of the Beis Hamikdash. He said, build houses, and he tells them, he said, plant gardens, seek a welfare of the city. He says building a house is a statement of prominence. He says this is Jeremiah starting point. Yet he moves on. We readers realize that the building a home is perhaps the least permanent act on Jeremiah's list of all the recommendations for exile. After all, he says, after all, no matter where you are, you need some form of shelter, even if, as an exile, you build something temporary in keeping with your desire to leave. Jeremiah moves from building houses to planting gardens. The Malbim observes the planting a garden implies a longer stay than building a house, since the process of sowing and cultivating requires time. He cites a verse from Isaiah that seems to imply the exact opposite of Jeremiah's thinking. They shall not build for others to dwell in, or plant for others to enjoy. The days of my people shall be as long as the days of a tree. My chosen ones shall outlive the work of their hands, and they shall not toil to purpose, they shall not bear children for terror. He says, whereby Isaiah does not want others to benefit from the planting of the garden, Jeremiah wants the gardeners to take advantage of what good can be found while the foreign soil to invest in their lives. He says in a midrash found in the famous Psalms. There's a midrash on the Psalms. He says the water of Babylon. The rabbis, he says the rabbis of old say that the question how we can sing a new song on strange land was not rhetorical but literal. The Levites. So he's saying there's a psalm and it says by the river of Babylon, right? And he says, and so the rabbis asked the question, how can we sing a new song on the strange land? Babylon, right? What do you mean you're singing in Babylon, right? Again, we're dealing with this exile. He said, this is not rhetorical, this is literal. He says, the Levites in their desperation cut off their thumbs so they would not be able to play their instruments for the enemy, King Nebuchadnezzar. Wow. He says they sat instead on the bank of the river and moaned their loss. But the Midrash alludes to something darker. By cutting off their thumbs, they also made themselves ritually unsuitable for serving God in the temple, the precinct after the exile. The signs of mourning that they are permanent can show profound loss, but may also reveal a lack of faith in the future. He says so he's saying this, there's certain conditions on what allows a person to do sacrifices, and like a deformity, these types of things will make you can't do it, right? And so he's saying like when they cut off their thumbs, one frame was, okay, they don't want to play their flutes because they're in this Babylonian land and they don't want to play for the king. And then another side of it is also saying like, well, Rabbi Sachs is saying, well, yeah, I get it that you don't want to play for the king, but it also makes you not suitable for the future temple service. So it makes me question, maybe the story is much deeper, right? Maybe it's showing a lack of faith in the creator as a whole and not just a form of resistance from Nebuchadnezzar. He says, we have met Jeremiah on many pages here and might not have expected him to offer us a positive prescription for exile. Yet he does. He tells us to become good people, raise children, and to be good citizens no matter where. He also offers us the belief that a stronger people will make a stronger nation when the exile is over and the redemption is on the horizon. He says Isaiah 2 offers his guidance on rebuilding. This is that idea of rebuilding. We think about the old rebuilding being, Noah, right? Noah came in and went through this whole process. We were given responsibility to rebuild a new world. And you think about the people like, like in the Holocaust or different things, they had to rebuild, right? You think about people like, I mean, just all people, so many places around the world, like people have to rebuild, people, they get divorced, have to rebuild. People lose people, you have to rebuild. We can't stop. You can't stop because the building is serving Hashem. Hashem doesn't stop building, neither do we. We have disappointments, we have, what they call the forks in the road, the potholes, whatever, but we never stop rebuilding. He said Isaiah 2 offers guidance on rebuilding. He says, and they should rebuild the old waste. They should raise up former desolations, and they shall renew the waste cities and desolation of many generations. We are the people who rebuild ruins, and when, as the Talmud teaches, we get up to heaven, and God teaches us, did you work for redemption? Okay. Let's understand this part. This is a closing part on this. He says, we are the people who rebuild ruins. And when, as the Talmud teaches, when we get to heaven, God is going to ask us, did you work for redemption? We can each say, yes, I did, with a full heart. So it's an interesting point that he's bringing out, right? Because normally you think like, really big ideas, right? We were talking earlier today, on the yeshiva about, just the idea of like just really thinking big and beyond imagination. And Rabbi Sachs is bringing us to a very grounded, a very practical approach to that, which is to never stop building. No matter what happens, don't stop building. Even when you have success, don't stop building, right? You have to continue to build. Any thoughts, any reflections, anything we'll share, any points, holidays, whatever?
Yes,
Yes.
get a little echo there. All right. Shalom. You know, this is just kind of reminds us of that, of course, life does not end, but there is still that reflection of having a purpose of building. Because I remember many years ago we looked at this verse, and what we saw that also is dealing with, building not only the structural house, but also building a family unit, a house. And you know, when you as you're building this house in a foreign land, you're building um, you're building a type of spiritual house that is going to honor Hashem in a distant land. And it's I always kind of I have always kind of looked at that verse, and I read the midrash, whereas the priests they cut their thumbs off, and it was, to me it always seemed like it was a level of defiance, um, and just a simple mindset of having a regret. But the it's kind of like, to me it was kind of like with the spies, the 10 spies. After the people believed the evil report, and then the judgment came out about their bad behavior, they decided to get up and they wanted to go fight. Just in another, just another bit of defiance. But with this letter, and I believe that letter was sent to the first group of the exile, those that were exiled, which would have been Ezekiel, it would have been Daniel, um, that group that was there before the destruction of the temple. And so it was like Hashem was telling them um, to basically stay focused, stay focused, and stay set apart within that land. That it's not just that you have to be holy in the land of Israel, or in a while the base, I mean the base, the temple is erect or there, or when you have access to it, but that you can also be holy outside by those demonstrations of obedience to that decree, to the instructions that was given to that group there. Toda.
Yeah, so we're just, we just been in this whole learning, this whole learning process of just, connecting to, this day that's it's a combination of holiness, but we have another day coming up too, Ba'av, which we'll talk about tomorrow probably, and that's the day of love, right? And as we spoke about this earlier, there's Taho Vuhu in creation before there is, Ve'ahi Or, before there's light, right? There's a golden calf before there is a Mishkan, right? There's a heartbreak before there is the perfect unification. Most guys will tell you before they, got settled with the wife, the wife, their partner, it was that girl in their life right before. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes it's engagement, sometimes it's fiance, sometimes it's even marriage, but it's always that experience. So there's always that aspect of like tohu, right? That kind of like chaotic experience before you get to the light. And part of this process of the temple and the rebuilding of the temple is connecting to that process of how light manifests itself in this world, right? And we talked about it earlier this morning. People check out the class. But either way, we're in it. Here I'm a little bit tired with the fast and everything, but we're pushing through it. Got a couple more classes, but we're getting close to the end. We're getting close to the end, and now we should be thinking about this aspect of like rebuilding the world. Like it's like if God said like spiritually, the physical world was created on in Elul, and Adam was created during the month of Tishri. We say during the month of Av, the spiritual reality was created, and in the ninth of Av, we had this destruction of it. So now that we went through the process of accepting what went wrong on this day, we could start building what's right, right? And we could do the complete opposite. So now this is the time, especially going into the afternoon, of contemplating like, what can we do right? How do we connect? How can we make a bigger impact in the world? How do we purify ourselves? Because this whole fast is just purifying us. It's such an amazing purification. And we could take this purification and we can move forward and start to create even better things for the world.